I'd like to welcome you to our first David S. Saurman Provocative Lecture for the fall of 2011. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for making this lecture series a success. This is, you may not know this, but this is our 10th anniversary of providing these lectures. Thank you. Thank you. My name's Jack Estel. I'm a lecturer here with the Department of Economics. This lecture series started in the fall of 2001 to foster our vision of higher education, challenging ideas and developing critical thinking in an environment of respect for intellectual discourse. As we have said before, please relax, ponder, and enjoy Anthony J. Evans as he discusses Russia's post-Soviet transition from communism. We will provide a question and answer period at the end of the presentation to allow the audience to explore specific ideas that you may have. We hope that our lecture series provides fresh perspectives and stimulates your critical thinking skills. Please welcome Professor Anthony J. Evans. He's the Fulbright Scholar in Residence at San Jose State University. Anthony joins us from ESCP Business School in Europe. It's one of the leading business schools where he's an associate professor. His research interests include corporate entrepreneurship, monetary theory, and transitional markets, which he'll be speaking of at some length tonight. He's also the co-author of The Neoliberal Revolution in Eastern Europe, and he has appeared on both Newsnight and BBC World. And we're pleased to have his collaboration in our department this semester, so he'll be here all semester with us, which is a great opportunity for us. And we're even more pleased to have him here tonight to speak with us. Let's give him a hand. Thank you.
Thank you. So I don't know, it's a great privilege for me to be invited to talk at the David Saurman Provocative Lecture. Obviously I didn't know him personally, but I know that he was very highly regarded around here. So it's an honor to be here and give this first lecture in the series. I'm going to try and be provocative, but not too provocative. If you know, I'm English, and if you know anything about English modern art, you'll know that English people don't know the dividing line between being provocative and being offensive. I'm going to try and stay on the side of provocation. Okay, I'm not going to walk around too much. I'm going to be tired. I'm being filmed for this, so I try and stay as close to the notes as possible when there's cameras on. So I'm going to stay firmly behind the desk here. I'm going to try and speak for about an hour. That's my aim, so that should leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end. But there's quite a lot of material that I want to get through because this is a very big topic and it's also a very important one. What I'm going to talk about is the dissolution of the Soviet Union and then the subsequent transition process that really started in 1991-92 across the entire Central and Eastern Europe and into Asia as well, with all of the countries that came out of the then Soviet Union. I think it's important to start off by putting this in a bit of context. It's now well over 20 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and this has become known as the Peaceful Revolution. It's important to remember over 200 million people moved from living under a communist regime to a capitalist one, and if prior to that people said this would be done without large-scale bloodshed, they might have been dismissed as being a fantasist. There was a surprising absence of civil disorder through this transition process. In Poland, there had been riots due to price increases in 1956, 1970, 1976, 1990. There'd been a massacre in the Soviet Union due to price increases for meat in 1962. So there's a long history of how price increases and these sorts of phenomena lead to civil unrest. And yet, to quote Anders Asland, to great positive surprise, no single post-communist price liberalization aroused social unrest. Following the immediate transition process, and I'm going to talk mostly about what happened in 92, 93, around that period, but since then there's been what's known as the color revolutions. For example, in November 2003 there was a revolution in Georgia, 2004 in the Ukraine, 2005 in the Kyrgyz Republic. These are known as the Rose, the Orange, and the Tulip revolutions. And the important thing about these, which again is important to stress, is that these were where fraudulent elections led to an overthrow of the government whilst respecting constitutions. So not only was the transition process itself remarkably calm, but it gave rise to a transition process, again, that was generally done within constitutions. It's very easy to underestimate the difficulty of the transition process. It's important to remind everybody that socialism failed miserably. We know now that 3 times the amount of inputs were needed for the same level of output in the Soviet Union as there were in the USA, regardless of inequality differences. We know now that real GNP was never even half the USA's in the Soviet Union, and the population was far higher. It's easier, and it can be quite difficult conceptually to look at some of these studies. It's easier to make a comparison between West Germany and East Germany. It's a lot more straightforward there. And again, the data is very clear. An East German would work 3 to 10 times, depending on your measure, longer to acquire the similar level of goods to somebody in West Germany. To really stress this, health levels declined over the period. And to kind of put things in perspective, in winter 1991, Russia had 2 months of grain left and the shops were empty. So it's easy to underestimate the scale of the problems at the dawn of transition. What I've got on a slide here is a number of different problems that had to be overcome. If it's a bit of a small font, don't worry. The key point of this slide is that there was lots of very difficult things to overcome, so you don't really need to sit in minute detail. But what I've got here is that you've got a situation where you have bankrupt public finances. These are being financed through a hyperinflation. There's no alternative supply network. Once you remove the state from the supply network, there aren't alternatives. There's negative value-added production. I'll come and talk about this in more detail, but basically the goods that are on the shelves of the shops, if there are goods on the shelves in the shops, are costing more to produce than they're delivering in satisfaction. You have entrepreneurs outside the formal economy, so the people who are the real kind of drivers of markets and prosperity are effectively criminals. There is distrust between policymakers and the general public. Put simply, the general public don't trust what policymakers are telling them. And then also established interest groups committed to rent seeking. If this sounds familiar, I've used a similar slide to this when I talk about the financial crisis and the economic policy in the UK at the moment. It's coming together quite quickly. But what I really want to focus on here is talking about these established interest groups committed to rent seeking. There's 2 main interest groups that you need to be overcome during a transition process. The first is basically bureaucrats. It seems quite obvious, but obviously there are bureaucrats that prosper under the previous regime, and they're going to want to block the transition process because it's going to effectively remove their power and their authority. It's not just bureaucrats that may want to block reforms, but also business people. Opportunistic business people may wish to obstruct reforms because there are arbitrage opportunities to take advantage of during a transition process. So there's these 2 very important groups that want the transition process to last quite a long time because they can prosper from holding it up. To give you an idea about some of the ways in which this can be held up, in Russia at the dawn of transition, it was very easy to arbitrage between fixed state prices for raw materials. Sorry, I beg your pardon. You could arbitrage between fixed state prices within Russia and free market prices abroad through multiple exchange rates. Okay? There's lots of different exchange rates, and if you were a savvy business person, you'd be able to make great profit from dealing in these multiple exchange rates. There was highly subsidized imports in Russia at the time. So, for example, it was very cheap to buy things like grain because they were so heavily subsidized. If you turned this into bread, then you could sell it for bread at market prices. Again, this is a massive arbitrage opportunity. At the time, state credit had fixed interest rates, so you could borrow money from the government at about 25%, and when inflation is running at 2,500%, this again presents a massive arbitrage opportunity. Direct subsidies accounted for about 10.4% of Russian GDP in 1992, so obviously there's a lot of clamor in order to try and acquire these resources. Now, despite all of these problems, there was a general consensus amongst economists about the direction these countries needed to move in. In fact, regardless of local culture, there's relatively few ways in human history that we've discovered to live within peace and prosperity. Generally speaking, what I'm going to call good economic policy is private property rights in order to generate incentives, a reliable legal framework in order to correct predation, a stable monetary system to maximize the quality of information, an open trade and the embrace of markets. I'm going to come on to some of these things, but it's important to stress that amongst economists, this is a general consensus. The debate wasn't about whether or not that sounds like the type of environment these countries should move towards. The only real debate was the speed at which they should move towards it. In transition, timing is everything. Do you want to bring in a free market economy or a relatively free market economy as soon as possible, or do you want to take it gradually? And generally, the transition debate is between gradualism and so-called shock therapy. Now, it's important to look at this gradual program and to look at it quite closely. At the time, there was organizations, for example, the UN Commission for Europe, who said that countries in the former Soviet Union shouldn't move too quickly to a market economy because before moving to a market economy, they needed to build the institutions that are necessary to create a market economy. The problem with this is that the countries that were saying, or the people that were saying, we need to build the institutions before we can move to a market economy, weren't in the process of building those institutions. Okay? So this should set off an alarm bell. There's essentially two different types of people who advocate gradualism. There's those who think it's genuinely the best way to bring about a market economy, and it's those who don't want a market economy and therefore want to engage in whatever activity they can to hold it up. In fact, when you look back, to quote Oleg, I can't pronounce, I'm not very good, I know some of you came here to hear an English accent, so I'm going to use an English accent rather than pretend to speak a Russian one. This was Oleg Havlashilian, who said, the proclamations of the political elites in these countries that the society was not ready for the market and a gradual evolution was necessary were not sincere proclamations and masked a hidden agenda. Or, in the words of William Lloyd Garrison, gradualism in theory is perpetuity in practice. Okay? Don't forget that throughout the history of the Soviet Union, there had been numerous attempts at reform. All the way from immediately after the Russian Revolution in 1917, different politicians had engaged in different attempts to reform with a gradualist agenda. The main argument in favor of a radical transition is to say that the state institutions that are supposedly having to be built in order to create a market economy are the very reason for the crisis happening in the first place. If the state is the problem, it's difficult to see how the state can also be the solution. Or, to quote Mart Laar, the Estonian Prime Minister, the window of opportunity does not last long. It quickly gives way to the more mundane politics of contending parties and interest groups, which is normal in established democracy. What we're really going to emphasize is the fact that timing is important, and during a transition period, a window opens up that some groups are attempting to keep open for as long as possible because they benefit from it, and other groups are trying to make as small as possible so that the reforms are as quickly as they can be. I've spoken a little about gradualism. It's important to kind of make a side point about the name shock therapy. Shock therapy as a term comes from psychology, where my understanding, and I'm not a psychologist, but my understanding, basically shock therapy is not a cure for any problem. What shock therapy does, it basically tries to create a kind of baseline around which psychologists can try and make people better again. So if people are kind of so far gone that they're kind of incapable of listening to reason, then shock therapy was literally administered to try and shock them into kind of a baseline so that they had literally no emotion at all, and then you can kind of inject onto that where you want them to be. Now, this is very different for how we're using shock therapy to talk about economic policy. With economic policy, the shock has already happened, right? That is the collapse of communism. That's the crisis moment. And what we're talking now is about economic policy to administer the cure. So it's very important to stress, shock therapy in psychology isn't intended to be a cure, and that's why the term shock therapy is very misleading when applied to the transition debate. What I'm going to kind of refer to as shock therapy is really radical policy change. Somebody who's very famous for promoting the label of shock therapy and criticizing it is Naomi Klein. I don't know if some of you are familiar with her book, The Shock Doctrine. But it's important to take some of these criticisms and complaints seriously. Jack mentioned the book that I co-authored with a Romanian called Paul Dragos Alejica, called The Neoliberal Revolution in Eastern Europe. In many ways, what this book tries to do is to take seriously some of the criticisms of the transition process and actually look and uncover whether or not they hold up when confronted with evidence. By the way, I was at a bookshop in town and I looked to see if they had any copies of this, and they didn't. So I don't know what I assumed that they were sold out, but I don't know. I was very disappointed. But anyway, what I want to just go through very quickly is what I do, and you can look at the book for more details, is essentially 4 myths to do with the transition process and how in the book we try and explain how they are myths. The first myth is that the main source of the spread of policy came from the West. In other words, the idea that it was Western intellectuals that came over to Eastern Europe and imposed policy reform on the locals. And when we look at it, we find that this is incorrect. The genuinely radical ideas were done within Central and Eastern Europe. I'm going to talk about Lech Balcerowicz later. I've already quoted Mark Lahr. It's very kind of patronizing, especially for Western intellectuals, to make the claim that this was something imposed on the East by the West. What you actually find is Western intellectuals going over to Eastern Europe during this period, thinking that they're going there to advise the government on how to engage in radical policy reform, and actually end up coming away learning something about how to engage in radical policy reform. The second myth is that the policies that were adopted remained constant throughout the transition process. In other words, there was this big lump of policies that was adopted, and then the countries were forced to stick with it no matter what. In actual fact, the economic theory that was being used in the region at the time fundamentally altered in response to the transition experience. For example, the rise of new institutionalism was in no small part based on the perceived failure of some neoclassical economic policies when applied to Central and Eastern Europe. The third myth that I want to try and expose is the idea that these policies were applied uniformly across Central and Eastern Europe, that this was like a one-size-fits-all. In actual fact, when you look more closely, you can see there was significant local mutation, and lots of these countries ended up coming up with new and novel theories unique to their own environment. And then fourthly, there's a myth that the policies were indeed what's known as neoliberal, or by neoliberal we mean kind of free market economic fundamentalism. In actual fact, most of the ideas that were being adopted in Eastern Europe at the time were standard neoclassical mainstream economics. I'll talk a bit about this to come. Compared to the general public, it can seem that standard mainstream neoclassical economics is quite extreme, but standard neoclassical economics is not market fundamentalism. It has a very refined theory of market failure. Most economists accept that monopolies and other asymmetric information and things are all standard fare of economic analysis. This isn't market fundamentalism. So that's a little bit about gradualism and about why radical transition or quick transition might be necessary. I want to walk through what has become synonymous with shock therapy, and that's the Balcerowicz plan. Now, what I've put here is in 4 bullet points, basically what the Balcerowicz plan is. Note, this is Lech Balcerowicz, the Polish finance minister, not an American. This isn't the Sachs plan. This isn't Stiglitz plan. This is named after the Polish finance minister because he was the guy that came up with the heavy lifting on this. Very simply, the plan was macroeconomic stabilization, deregulation, privatization, and a social safety net. These are what I broadly spoke as constituting good economic policy before. I'll go through each of them in turn. The first, macroeconomic stabilization. This is very important because all of these countries are engaging in hyperinflations, so it's very important that you have fiscal discipline. In all of these countries, they don't have ministries of finance, they don't have independent central banks, so these institutions actually need to be built, they need to be created. In terms of stabilizations, a chart that often gets looked at when focusing on the transition experience is what happened to output. And what I've got here, sorry, I just knocked my, can you still hear me at the back? Yeah. What I've got here is the GDP growth rate. I've split this up into different blocks of countries, those that had no reform, radical reform, and partial reform. And what this is showing is the output of GDP over time. Now, this is a fairly typical story that you see output drop and then rise again, and this is what lots of people point to cast doubts on whether the transition process was a success or not. But there's some important things we need to bear in mind when we think about growth figures in this context. Firstly, the quality of the numbers are different. Okay? It may well be the case that we see output fall in the most reforming countries because they're the ones that have the better quality data. Okay? It should be no surprise that the countries that don't have any reform have a steadier change in output. It's possibly just because the quality of their data is less reliable than the countries that are undergoing reform. So the quality of the numbers are different. A bit more kind of importantly, the two different systems are biased in different directions. If you think about living under a Soviet system, you get paid for what you produce, which sounds quite normal, but the incentive, therefore, is to overstate how much you produce. Okay? In a Western system, you get taxed on what you produce. Okay? So your incentive is to underreport your economic activity. And this is, for example, things like black markets. This is why the black market expands and grows, because a lot of economic activity starts taking place informally. Okay? So because of this inherent bias in these numbers, we would expect this change in output to take place. We would expect that official statistics overestimate the health of the Soviet economy in 1989 and then underestimate the health of the economy after that. And thirdly, sometimes a drop in output is a good thing. Drops in output are a good thing if companies are producing negative economic value. If it's costing more in the cost of resources to make goods and services than the value that they're creating for consumers, it's a good thing to have a fall in measured output. According to Andrei Schleifer, much of the lost output is for products that had no consumer demand. And note, this is something that we're going through now as we've come back from the financial crisis. There's lots that we're seeing a recession, and part of that recession is realizing that we were previously producing goods and services that did not have a market demand, and the first step for a correction is to see a fall in measured output. To quote Anders Aslund, a substantial part of the recorded decline, probably about half, was not real but can be explained with mismeasurement, an expansion of the unregistered economy, and the elimination of value detraction. The second facet of the Bolshevik plan is deregulation. In other words, allowing supply and demand to set prices, cutting subsidies, liberalizing trade, breaking up monopolies, in other words, allowing market forces to work. And free trade is very important here because being more open to trade allows you to alleviate some of these shortages. If the state was producing everything beforehand, it's very important that you open up trade so that you can import the goods that you're now no longer producing. I said before that there was an academic or an economic consensus on some of these issues. In a recent survey, the members of the American Economic Association were asked whether they agree with the statement, the US should eliminate remaining tariffs and other barriers to trade. 87.5% said yes. So often when I give talks to non-economists, they think I might be kind of overstating the case to say that there's a consensus amongst economists in the importance of free trade. But this is the fact, and survey data bears it out. The third step is privatization. Privatization comes in two forms. One is to sell off existing state companies to the private sector, but the other form is to allow new businesses to be created, to make it easier for people to start a business. Privatization is a crucial aspect of a transition process because it's taking resources out of publicly held plans and into market plans. The results of privatization are fairly clear. A 2003 OECD study showed, quote, overwhelming support for the idea that, quote, privatization brings about a significant increase in the profitability, real output, and efficiency of privatized companies. Generally speaking, privatization is a good thing for economic activity. And the transition process in Central and Eastern Europe was a massive experiment in privatization. Never had privatization occurred on such a scale. In the first 10 years of transition, over 150,000 large and medium enterprises were privatized, hundreds of thousands of small firms were created, and millions of apartments were sold off. Now, the reason why this is important Just to look at a little bit of data here, this is just the correlation between the size of the private sector, i.e. the extent of privatization, and democracy. The y-axis here is on an inverted scale, so the lower down you go, the more democracy there is. But there's a very clear correlation here between the countries that privatize the most and the countries that have the most democracy. We can quibble about correlation and causation issues and things, but the very kind of simple correlation should be seen as being very, very straightforward. Not only does more privatization correlate with more democracy, but also more privatization correlates with less corruption. And again, on this chart, the y-axis is showing the higher the number, the more clean, and the lower the number, the more corrupt. So these countries, Estonia, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, these are countries that have more privatization and they have less corruption. And the countries that are the lowest are Turkmenistan and Belarus, which I'll come on to briefly at the end. Now, this doesn't mean that privatization is perfect. In Russia in particular, the privatization process was corrupt, it was slow, and it was largely self-defeating. One of the arguments against the privatization process in Russia was that the people didn't get to share in it enough. But in actual fact, in a typical large firm privatization, only 14% of shares were owned by outsiders. In many cases, about 70-80% of the shares of companies would be owned by the managers and the workers. Now, this should strike people as being somewhat of a problem because it's not necessarily in the case of the managers of the company to run it profitably if there needs to be difficult decisions to be made. And there's examples of how this is kind of job preservation and trying to kind of keep the company running along the same lines. And in many cases, having outside ownership is more likely to convert that company into a profitable one. 2 points to note, though, on the privatization process. We should expect privatization process to be flawed. If we know what the market value of a company is, then we don't need to privatize it. The whole reason for privatizing something is that we have no idea how valuable it is because it doesn't have market prices operating. So it should be relatively common that we get surprised when we have a privatization program that the end-up market prices don't correlate with activity. It's very much a discovery process and not something policymakers can be expected to get right. But the choice here is really not between perfect privatization and no privatization. The choice is between botched privatization and no privatization. Okay, and I'll come back to this, but really what we have to think about is whether or not botched privatization is better than nothing at all, regardless of whether or not it could be improved upon. The final stage of the Bolshevist plan, and this comes as a surprise to many people because they associate shock therapy with essentially being a very radical market reform that allows ordinary people to become destitute. But there's an important component of the Bolshevist plan, which is a social safety net. Generally speaking, the expectation is that unemployment will rise and that there will be inflation during a transition process, and therefore most transition plans have scope to help displaced workers, whether that's to find new jobs or not, and to also help people who've lost their life savings through hyperinflation. If anything, you could argue that the social safety net during the transition process was too high rather than too low. Health expenditures rose in real terms as a share of GDP across Central and Eastern Europe from 4% in 1990 to 6% in 2003. In places like Hungary, it constituted 8.4% of GDP was spent on healthcare. In the Czech Republic, 7.5% on GDP. So there's certainly a lot of money being spent on these safety nets. However, it could be argued that the size of public spending in many cases impeded transition. For example, in Russia and the Ukraine, 10% of social transfers went to the poorest 20% of the population. Let me say that again. Only 10% of social transfers ended up in the hands of the poorest 20% of the population. Again, in Russia, about 70% of social transfers ended up going to the wealthiest 30%. Now, there's two ways that you can interpret that. One is that this is a very bad plan, that there should be more time in investment in making this a plan that actually helps and sends the money to the right place. Another is to recognize that it's the institution itself that's flawed here, and therefore you cannot rely on that institution to enact a sensible reform plan. Or to put it another way, more money isn't going to help that problem. A change in the institutions is necessary. Another important social indicator, by the way, is mortality rate. So I'd just like to show this slide, which is to show how the mortality rate fell across the board before, in the build-up to, and after the transition process as well. When you talk about healthcare as a percentage of GDP and other kind of economic figures like this, it's important to remember the kind of the indicators that are really important, which is arguably things like child mortality rates. Now, there's a general view that some of these transition policies were unpopular and that the public in these countries didn't like them. The evidence, though, suggests that this isn't the case. Communist parties fared poorly regardless of country and policy. But if you look at all post-communist countries, governments that pursued radical reforms fared better in democratic elections than gradualist governments. It's common in this period to find governments get voted in and then very quickly voted out again. Rotation of office is very common. But if you look at all countries and all democratic elections, the parties that were promoting radical reforms tended to, all else equal, do better than those advocating gradual reforms. If you look at opinion polls, there's a general consensus that people in these countries thought that their reforms in their countries was happening too slow as opposed to too fast. Okay, I now want to talk about Russia. Russia is a special case. And by looking at Russia more closely, we can see some very important insights into transition. Now, one of the strengths of the Baltrovitz plan was that it was credible. It was comprehensive, it was consistent, and it was credible. The role of rhetoric is incredibly important here. Russia has a history of people not trusting what politicians are telling them. In other words, not believing that reform plans are genuine. In 1992, the rhetoric of the Russian government was that it was going to become a democratic capitalist society. However, the reality said something different. If you go to a country and it says that they've liberalized prices and liberalized markets, and you see wide-scale black markets, then guess what? They haven't liberalized markets. Similarly, if you see a country that says that we've reduced all foreign currency controls and you see wide-scale capital flight, then there's a clear sign that what the policy changes are don't tally with what the proclamations are. Now, any transitional government faces a serious problem. The question is, how credible is the professed commitment to their reforms? Are they genuine about moving to a market society, in which case people are going to, and again, your entrepreneurs at this point are essentially criminals because they're operating in the underground economy. If you're saying we're now a market economy, we want you to come out of the darkness and to actually start trading publicly, then they need to trust that these are sincere reforms and that you're not going to go back into where you came from. So the real question about Russia was Boris Yeltsin a credible reformer? This is the only joke in my presentation, by the way. So thank you, that was a better line. The problem with Yeltsin was that he wasn't a credible reformer. The title for my talk I borrowed from my PhD advisor, Peter Betke, who wrote an article called Yeltsin's Shock Therapy Applied Too Little Voltage. Any reform process is a matter of credibility. The rhetoric of liberalization needs to be accompanied by deep, genuine, and credible structural reforms. However, basically speaking, the market didn't buy the Russian government's claims that they had reformed. At the time, there was free market economists in the region that were making this point, but they were largely unlistened to. As a very clear example, price liberalization in Russia began in January 1992. Within 2 months, Boris Yeltsin was condemning profiteering and imposing quantity limits on sales. In other words, the rhetoric outpaced reforms. At this point, you can draw an interesting parallel with China, which to some arguments you could say that China is the opposite of Russia, where China has had actual real reforms take place, but the rhetoric has been that they haven't. Okay? Russia's the opposite. Russia said that they were reforming and didn't. China's saying that they're not reforming, but they are. So the question is, did shock therapy actually happen? And there's an argument to say that in Russia, no, it did not. For example, if you have a budget deficit, if the government is broke, or if the government on behalf of the people is broke, then most economists would say you need to cut government spending. You'd have some economists that would say you might want to increase taxation as well, and economists will argue about what the proportion, what the mix should be. But generally speaking, the economic advice, if you have a budget deficit, is to cut government spending. What did Russia do? It printed money to cover the deficit. Okay? You will not find an economist, maybe recent events have kind of changed this ever so slightly in one direction, but not totally. You will very rarely find an economist that says the proper way to deal with a budget deficit is hyperinflation. Apart from Paul Krugman, apart from him. To quote Jeffrey Sachs talking about Russia, the advice that I gave, eliminate price controls, stop subsidies to loss-making state enterprises, make the currency convertible, and open the economy to trade. This kind of economic medicine produced an end of hyperinflation and strong economic growth in Poland, Estonia, Slovenia, and other countries that I advised. The same advice would have worked in Russia, but it was not followed. Okay? So it wasn't followed in Russia, and as I said at the beginning, this slow process of transition created lots of opportunities for exploitation, and it was exploited by the oligarchs. I'm going to speak a little bit about the role of the oligarchs. I like this quote, businesses, people who are playing the game which the state is offering them, which I think is the kind of the seminal motto of the oligarchs here. What I'm going to argue is a slightly contrarian view. I'm going to say that the biggest scandals regarding oligarchs in Russia were either overstated or contrary to economic advice on the transition process. The most controversial role of the oligarchs in Russia was the so-called loans for shares scandal. This was a scheme that was proposed in 1995. It's important to realize that in 1996 there was an election. At that time, there was a very real chance that communists would come back to power. The idea of the loans for shares scheme was that Russian businessmen would give the government's loans in exchange for shares in strategic assets that would later be sold and privatized. The basic problem here is that the Russian government was privatizing lots of its resources, but it wasn't selling off the valuable ones. So all of these businessmen are buying up these privatized resources, but saying what we really want to buy are the well-run companies, the profitable ones, the ones that have the market. But they were kept under state control. In the lead up to this election, Boris Yeltsin basically had no money, so they did a deal where the businessmen said, okay, we'll lend you some money on the condition that you actually allow potentially profitable companies to be part of the privatization process. What this meant was that the businessman that was giving the government the loans ended up buying back these companies for very cheap prices and becoming very wealthy. It's important to realize that this policy was nothing to do with economic advice. It was nothing to do with the transition policy on how to kind of promote economic welfare. This was a very, very quick and simple political deal in order to try and fight an impending election. The father was Anatoly Chubai. He says, tomorrow I would do the same, if only for winning the battle with the communists, which it was at the time. Having said this, it's not altogether clear to me that the loans for shares scandal led to a disastrous outcome. So my interest in this was to think about some of the companies that were set up in this, and to actually take a look and to see what the history was. For example, one of the companies was Norilsk Nickel. This was a state-owned mining company that was privatized in 1997. Those who were involved in buying it out became very famous oligarchs such as Vladimir Potanin. Within a year of the sale of the company, it had paid all salary debt, restructured outstanding debts, and began a crisis management process. So in the previous years, the workers hadn't received any salary income. Within 1 year of it being privatized, all employees had received their salaries. There'd been no reinvestment in this company for over 20 years, and yet by the early 2000s, Vladimir Potanin had invested $1 billion back into the company. I'm trying to be quite controversial here. I often hope that one day there'll be an oligarch sat in the audience to one of these lectures and be willing to sponsor my research. But as yet, if there is, then come and see me at the end. But as yet, I'm just... Another company that was famous for this is Yukos. This was a Russian oil and gas company. It was created in 1993 and produced 20% of Russia's oil, which is a lot. The minority stake was privatized for $310 million, and the argument was that this drastically underestimated the market value of the company, and therefore this was crony capitalism to allow somebody to pay such little money for it. But note that by 2000, the annual tax bill was $6 billion. That $6 billion a year was being raised by the company. One argument would be it doesn't matter so much what the selling price of it is if it is turned into a successful company that contributes to so much economic activity. Now, it's important to note that tax issues with the Russian government led to its bankruptcy in 2007, and the oligarch that was in control of it, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, now happily resides in Siberia. The reason why the oligarchs did so well in Russia was because very few people have their skills, and the oligarchs' skills were on two counts. Firstly, they had good management skills, and they were able to run large companies. Okay? The bureaucrats weren't able to run large companies, but there were some oligarchs who had the ability to run a large company and to make them profitable. But they also had knowledge of the local norms and the country-specific situation to get business done in a very challenging and difficult environment. To kind of push this point about the positive role of the oligarchs, if you look at the role of organized crime in Russia, organized crime emerged spontaneously due to the lack of the rule of law. So there was no rule of law in Russia. Organized crime arose. You could argue that it came to exploit this fact, but really it came to try and resolve it, to step in where the government was failing. To quote Volkov, since the actions of the state bureaucracy and of law enforcement remain arbitrary and the services provided by the state tend to have higher costs, private enforcers, i.e. the mafia, outcompete the state and firmly establish themselves instead. Now, the oligarchs didn't enjoy being exploited by criminals. So what happened was oligarchs started to employ their own security and create private security forces. As early as 1995, these private security forces created by oligarchs had squeezed out organized crime. The Russian murder rate peaked in 1993. Racketeering fees gradually fell from 1993 onwards. In fact, the Russian government couldn't compete with the private security, so they ended up legalizing it and basically say this is all part and parcel of the state. It took about 7 years before the state finally took back control and began to clamp down on these private security organizations. And now we're in a situation where the Russian government is effectively able to jail businessmen completely arbitrarily. Oh, beg your pardon. So, oligarchs responded to the prevailing conditions. It's very difficult to find any evidence whatsoever that oligarchs created those prevailing conditions. What tended to happen was that oligarchs profiteered for as long as the transition window was open. So if there was a long transition process, then there was a lot of ability for oligarchs to exploit and to take advantage of that. However, when the transition process started to end, what you saw was consolidation and investment. To quote Andrei Schleifer, the audited financial statements of these companies suggest that their assets have grown dramatically, especially since 1998. The major oligarchs have been investing hundreds of millions of dollars annually in their companies. In contrast, the greatest asset-stripping scandals occurred in companies that remained under state control. Okay? So if you want to look at examples of real asset stripping, and I'll tell you a very simple anecdote to this. I was in Russia as a 10-year-old in 1991-92, and I was staying with a Russian family, and we went off to play one day. And in England, you'd go off to the park or something and play on the swings and the slides, which was what I was expecting. And he said, we're going to go to the museum. So I thought, this is very interesting. So we went to the museum, and instead of going through the door, and I realized it wasn't actually a museum, it was just an army base. But we didn't go through the door, we went round the back where all of the tanks were parked. And this little guy, he was about 12, 13, he got a screwdriver out, jumped into one of the tanks and started dismantling the equipment. And that was what we were doing for fun. We'd just go into basically an army base and taking out the resources. Now, this is what basically children were doing in their spare time, and then going down to the market and selling all of these different spare parts so that people could make cars and things. Okay? But what you have to imagine is that situation writ large, where anyone that was had kind of a position of authority in a company was essentially taking as many assets as they could for their own personal gain. By contrast, what the oligarchs tended to do is, for as long as the transition window was open, they would be engaged in this activity. But then when it shut, they began consolidation and reinvesting in these companies to try and make them as profitable as possible. The last chart that I want to show is this one. This is showing a structural reform index on the vertical axis, and then it's just showing how this changed over time. And again, this is split up into different countries, between countries in Central and Eastern Europe, between countries in the CIS states, and then also the 3 countries that are labeled as non-reformers. It's obvious and fairly self-explanatory that the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, i.e. the countries that reformed the most, had the biggest change or the biggest increase in their kind of structural index, the biggest change in their institutions. What I think is really interesting and important about this chart, though, is that you can see that up until about 1994, 1996, whatever reforms you got done before 94, 96 pretty much determines where you'll be 10 years later. Okay? Or to quote Anders Aslund, the longer the first jump, the farther each country went. This is the kind of the classic example, refutation of the gradualist theory, because you have, let's say, 1, 2, maybe 3 years of transition under which you can get these reforms in place. If you don't take advantage of that, then you will essentially find it very, very difficult to enable any form of reform. The window only lasts a couple of years. Now, when you see people debating about shock therapy or gradualism or different strategies to take place in the transition process, what you almost always see is people comparing real cases with idealized cases. The only countries that genuinely engaged in the Balshevitz plan type or so-called shock therapy were Poland, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And then these are the countries that you could reasonably say engaged in shock therapy type plan, even though the term is problematic. Countries such as Hungary engaged in gradual reforms, countries such as Russia, Romania, even more gradual reforms, but there were countries that engaged in no reforms at all. Belarus, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan didn't become market democracies. They are currently authoritarian, essentially authoritarian dictatorships. They should be the point of comparison when we're talking about the transition process. Not every country went through a transition process. You can't take it for granted that each country would get through a transition process. Therefore, when the opportunity is available for radical and comprehensive economic reforms, your choice is to basically either take it or not. When you hear people like Joseph Stiglitz, who's very guilty of this, basically kind of saying that Poland was a policy reform failure, he has in mind what Poland would have happened if they'd have listened to him. Okay? This is the problem with people like Joe Stiglitz. Basically, his alternative is always he needs to be in charge. Okay, so he is perfect at explaining why policy mistakes get made, but then his solution is always, if I was in charge, then it would have been okay. Okay, but he has in mind basically what would have happened to Poland if he was in charge and they'd listened to him. What you should compare Poland to is not Poland under Joe Stiglitz, which is idealized and hypothetical, but essentially Belarus. Which is what Poland could have become had it not engaged in genuine, important reforms. I want to bring this to a close by kind of signaling some praise for economists here, because economists did play a very important role in the transition process, and it's a role that is often neglected or under-celebrated. Of 21 communist countries at the dawn of transition, 18 of them are now market economies. By contrast, only 10 of them are democracies, and even fewer than that have the rule of law. And as Aslan says, market economic reforms have been highly successful, whereas democratization has been partially auspicious, and the introduction of the rule of law even less so. In other words, we pretty much know how to create a market economy. Or you could say that economists are some way away from achieving that, but we are better at creating a market economy than political scientists are at creating democracy, and legal scholars are at creating the rule of law. So, to conclude, I just want to make a couple of bullet points to finish up. The Bolshevik plan, or so-called shock therapy, works where it was tried. The countries with the most radical reforms seem to have had the most successful reforms. Policy failures, for example, in Russia, tended to be deviations from these plans, or in many cases, failure to adopt them in the first place. The main lesson here is that you can't choose between radical reforms and perfect reforms. You can only choose between radical reforms and the most likely alternative. And certainly in the case of transition in Eastern Europe, that is a choice between radical reform or no reform at all. I know that some people have had class to go to, and I was asked to keep it to about an hour. So I pause there and we can do Q&A, and then if you do need to leave to go to class or things, then now's a good time to make a move. Thank you.
So I understand the premise here is that radical reforms are basically, if you want transition to a market economy, that's the way to go. What about market reforms here in the United States? Should we invoke radical changes in order to get back to market economy?
So the implication of what I've said for a country like the US is quite interesting, because there's a big debate about this. The implication is that there's little chance of having radical reforms unless there's a crisis. Okay, so it's pretty much in the normal politics of things, it's very difficult to solve the problem. And so what you unfortunately have to see is that we kind of go along until there is some kind of crisis, and that's when there's scope for ideas. Now, saying that, many people, and I'm talking about people like Naomi Klein now, and generally critics of market economies or free market economists, therefore kind of interpret that as saying we need to create a crisis, right? Or that we are basically going to go off and her argument is that Milton Friedman, I may be doing her a slight disservice, but her argument is that Milton Friedman effectively created, instigated these sorts of crises purely so that he can apply his, radical economic ideas. That's not the case. The crisis happens, and that's what goes on. And if you look at the work of someone like Bob Higgs, he's shown that historically, it is the typical case is that these crisis moments lead to an increase in the size and scope of the state. It's historically rare for the crisis to actually turn into market reforms. That's my interest in Eastern Europe, is because it's one of the rare cases where there was a crisis situation and it led to, market reforms. And these are policies that the UK and the US have been unable to adopt and to enforce. So unfortunately, the pessimistic side is that you can have, there's a lot of kind of policy reforms that you can do on a kind of general basis, but if you want to do something radical, and by that I mean essentially solve the problem, then you need to wait for that crisis, and that's why it's very important to be prepared when a crisis comes. If you look at the financial crisis that we've just experienced, there's been a massive rise in interest in the work of Keynes and the work of Hayek. Okay, and this is what is going to happen. There'll be a crisis, and then people will look for alternatives, and it's a very fertile time to be having these debates.
Thank you for coming here today and presenting. It was very, very good. What improvements do you think Russia itself would still need to make to go forward themselves, if any?
So I'm not well read on the current situation in Russia. It seems to be quite depressing because, and as I kind of alluded to at the end, market institutions are kind of necessary but not sufficient conditions to make wide-scale prosperity. I essentially made the argument that you need to get them in first and early, because it's very difficult to kind of to build the kind of other institutions that they rest on. But the problem in Russia is effectively that it didn't go far enough in order for those reforms to stick, and the fact that it never established things like the rule of law or kind of democracy is now really kind of starting to hurt it as it slides backwards.
What kind of jumps do you think they're going to be making in the Middle East countries? I'm thinking about different, market government dictator kind of models of Iran, the changes that Egypt is going through. Where do you see the biggest jumps going there, or not?
I don't think I'm qualified to speculate on how those sorts of reforms will take place. All I could say is that there's an opportunity for market reforms to take place. And what we're seeing there is essentially a moment that can go in one of two directions. I have this interest in the color revolutions, and there was almost one in Belarus in 2006. And people aren't really familiar with that, but there was a revolution that took place there. There was people protesting on the streets, and basically that was kind of quelled, and it went on as normal, and nothing happened. So you can see these kind of you can see uprisings happen across these regions, and then it's very difficult to know what's going to happen. All I feel qualified to say is that there is an opportunity for those ideas to be enacted now, and if they don't get enacted now, then they never will. But I don't know how it would pan out.
Is China an example of gradual change?
It's a good question. I would say that it probably is, and I think that's a sign of why gradual change is bad. I used to, if I do a longer version of this talk, I think I have the slide here. So again, I made this kind of point that you can contrast China to Russia and say that it's actually had more kind of genuine reforms than Russia's had over a period, even though the rhetoric is different. According to the figures I have, China brought 250 million people out of poverty since its autarky ended in 1978. So you could interpret that as being a sign of how important gradual reforms are and successful. However, despite the dramatic reduction of poverty over the last 20 years, 26.1 million people still live in poverty. So it depends on how you interpret those two things, the fact that they've made massive gains in that period of time, but they still have a long way to go. My interpretation of that would be that it's a step in the right direction, but if they'd have made 2 steps in the right direction, or they'd even run in the right direction, then it would have been an even more prosperous country now, and that should be welcomed. But just having said that, it's very difficult. The difficulty here is just kind of talking about China as a whole. And really, as we know, that there are regions of China that have effectively taken complete shock therapy and complete price liberalization. And they're the ones that are driving the growth in China, and there's some regions that are being held back. So I think if you kind of split it up, then you can do a fairly natural experiment and look at the shock therapy regions of China, compare them to the gradualist ones, and I think what I'm talking about would bear out. Yeah.
Do you feel that that a combination of the gradualism and shock therapy would have created better or greater results in Central and Eastern Europe?
So generally speaking, I think that the more gradual you are, the less likely you will end up with meaningful reforms. And I think that the more gradual you are, the more you create additional ways that will slow that transition process. So one of the main reasons in favor of gradualism is basically the human cost of shock therapy, and saying that shock therapy may work in theory, but in practice it creates lots of devastation to people's lives and things. But the problem with that is that any gradualist policy that attempts to deal seriously with those issues fail. So in theory, it would be good possibly to have a very large social safety net, so you have a very gradual policy where people can gradually retrain and move into more productive employment over time. But this is where the realm of politics comes in. We don't see evidence of that happening. And if you create a bureaucracy and fund it in order to try and, even if you have the intention of that sort of gradual reform, the evidence shows that that will tend to get captured and it won't deliver those results. Just in the recently, I don't know if it's news over here, in the UK there was one of the biggest arguments against quick economic policy is against Margaret Thatcher's reforms, which were fairly quick when she shut down things like mines, and you had entire cities that were immediately kind of all out of work and things. The main argument against the mining industry is that if you have a gradualist policy in the mining industry, then you are forever encouraging more and more people to enter it. Okay, and so there's a really big problem there, like where you kind of make an argument that, okay, if we could manage this somehow so that people keep their jobs, but then as they retire, we don't replace them with new people that are coming into an industry that can't support them. But no, I don't think anybody's figured out a way for that to work. And what normally happens is, if you keep an industry alive because you are worried about the human cost, you are sucking more and more people into a way of life that can't sustain them. And in the UK, just a couple of weeks ago, there was a mining disaster where most people think that the mines were completely broken up under Thatcher. But there was a mining disaster where several people died in a mine in the UK. And the outcome there is why these guys still, why we still, I thought we got rid of the mines, and if we didn't, then we should have done, because they're really dangerous places and there's more effective ways of getting materials. But that's the human cost of keeping them open, is that people die.
Hi.
Sorry.
Yeah, you discussed 4 steps to the shock therapy, and I think the most difficult one out of those 4 is the microeconomic stabilization. That's when you're working on cutting back expenses and fiscal responsibility on the government standpoint, but that's very difficult, and that really strikes a chord with the society and with the people and their emotions. So how do you deal with that?
It is, but then this is relevant to the US and the first question that came up. The good thing was that in this situation, people knew, the public knew that the state was bankrupt. So it made it quite easy to make essentially austerity measures and to say that we're going to cut government spending in order to balance the budget. Similarly, there was hyperinflation, so it became relatively easy to set up institutions that had the sole remit of keeping inflation under control. In the US and in the UK, to a large extent at the moment, there isn't a widespread acceptance that the budget is bankrupt, and there's not a kind of a widespread acceptance that it's important to maintain monetary stability and to keep inflation under control and things like that. So the argument in favor of this is that people understood that was a problem. Therefore, there was more kind of willingness to take some of that kind of hard medicine. Certainly in the UK, many people have not confronted the fact that the country is effectively bankrupt, and so they still believe that we don't need to go through a transition process at all. In this situation, if the public kind of accept that and it's widely acknowledged, then it makes it easier to do some unpopular policies.
Well, it sounds like you're describing the problem of Greece, where it doesn't seem like the people recognize that there's a big problem and that they're not willing to make any kind of adjustments in the fiscal level. So what can you say about Greece making some kind of reforms, either gradual or through shock therapy, given that there seems to be a crisis that the international organizations are telling us, but people are not connecting with it?
I think that I don't know. I mean, I think that the public opinion is that there is a problem, but that it's going to get bailed out. So people are expecting that the EU will do what it needs to do to make sure that a massive crisis is averted. I think it's interesting to compare. When we talk about Greece now, don't ignore Ireland, because Ireland was the first country that, in all of that kind of region, the first real sovereign crisis was Ireland. And it had this massive austerity campaign and slashed government spending to try and deal with that. And we don't hear much about Ireland now. And one of the reasons for that, arguably, is the fact that the Irish people very much recognised that they were effectively bankrupt and that there was a massive cost that they were going to have to go through in order to restructure the economy. I think it's interesting that that's almost fallen off the radar, And you had people at the time saying that this is going to lead to the complete desolation of the Irish economy. And it's certainly not growing very quickly at the moment. But compared to what when we're looking at what's going on in Greece and Portugal now, it should be surprising that we're not also talking about Ireland, given that it was in the worst position at the beginning. But again, it's a public recognition. People in the EU still think that we can somehow miraculously grow out of it.
So, Anthony, 2 questions for you. I wonder if you could fill in a little bit of the detail of the experience in Poland, given that we have one of the leaders of Poland coming in a couple of months.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, yesterday was the release of the 2011 report of the economic freedom of the world. And because of the many studies that have been done using the data that are in this annual report, we know that there are strong correlations between the types of institutional arrangements that you're talking about, open markets, quality legal system, stable money, limited government, and so forth. Those things correlate not only with economic variables such as GDP and incomes, but also a number of quality of life measures, things like longevity and health and peace and you name it. I wonder if you could talk to some of the relative comparisons of the shock versus gradual in terms of these broader quality of life measures.
I guess one way to answer that is that you don't get so my argument is that you don't get the economic, you don't get to boost up the economic freedom rankings through gradualist measures. So the only way to do that, so all of those, so I buy the correlation between the kind of the non-economic indicators of prosperity that correlate very closely with GDP and things like that. And my argument is to get all of that, you need to have radical reforms. And that you don't get any of that. So there's not, I don't think you can, if you look closely at the data, you could probably pick stuff apart, but I don't think you can really make a meaningful claim about this speed at which different countries have done that. For me, it's a lot more kind of black and white, and that you need, that's a precondition of the reform rather than one of the consequences. The reason why I did the infant mortality is because I think it is really important that we use those non-economic indicators. And then the Economic Freedom Report it does a fantastic job at showing what those correlations are. In terms of Poland, I'm not an expert of Poland in particular, but what I think is very important is whenever I've given this talk or similar talks in Eastern Europe, there will always be people that say we were better off under communism. And then I ask them what their parents did for a living, and then we go back to the diagram where I show you the businessmen and the bureaucrats who have an incentive to keep the status quo. And the problem is that you tend to give, there's almost a selection bias because you tend to have, educated people tend to be in those positions, and they also tend to have their children at universities that come and listen to me talk, for example. But I think it's important when this is something to talk to him about as well. It's difficult it's easy to overstate the case and say that gradual shock therapy leads, everyone lives happily ever after. And it's important to realize that there's no such thing as a reform process that's kind of Pareto optimal, where everybody is made better off. But it's important to keep the numbers in context, to make the case that socially it's an advancement. And then to actually, when challenged on that, I like to kind of find out a bit more about who's doing the challenging, and almost always it's those groups. Not economics professors, though, because there were no economics professors, right? So there was no such thing as business studies or economics. You had to study, sociology or whatever if you wanted to learn about the economy. So if you find people in economics departments, then they tend to be, more enthusiastic about what I'm talking about than even I am.
Do you think shock therapy would be feasible for the U.S. socialist Social Security and Medicare systems?
Again, the precondition is a crisis moment. So it's whether that crisis moment comes, and you can kind of split the crisis into two things: a kind of a genuine crisis, like a objective crisis, or a widespread recognition that there's a crisis. And you possibly don't need both of them to happen, but you certainly need to have a widespread recognition. And my understanding is that majority of the people in the US don't recognize that Social Security is bankrupt and that there's a problem. If there is a widespread recognition, if people at some point do begin to realize that the US is effectively bankrupt, then that might be a crisis situation, in which case something radical can be done. But what will probably happen is that you will have a period of time where it will kind of come to a head, and then there will be a reform package which is trumpeted as being something that's going to move to a very different system, but it will be a gradual program, and therefore it will be very kind of little difference, and it will just be able to buy a bit more time before the next problem comes.
But is it possible to have a quick transition away from Social Security when millions of people are receiving it?
I mean, I don't. So, I mean, it is possible to do it. It might not necessarily be desirable. I don't think even the most kind of radical proponents of reform to Social Security, I don't think they're advocating changing too much the entitlements of people that presently have entitlements. So it's more of a kind of keeping the system as it is for people that are on it, but then as of today, we don't enter people into it. And I think that would constitute a radical reform of just saying, as of tomorrow, this thing is bust, we're not going to keep sending people into it. But it would need to be a crisis before that would become, palatable.
Okay, thank you.
Speak into it.
Speak into it. Oh, wow. All right. Okay. This is rather daunting, yes. The classical liberal worldview is not just about markets being more efficient and raising prosperity, but also about the just acquisition of property. Mm-hmm. And you didn't really touch, I guess you may have alluded to it, one or 2 points, but you didn't really, it seemed to me, deal with the issue that there was massive misappropriation of assets under the oligarchs, in the sense of a considerable amount of wealth was acquired by people with no just claims, and that they continue to own huge amounts of wealth. And I guess I have a two-part question: is what do you think about it all? And secondly, more specifically, do you think you can have workable shock therapy without this misappropriation of assets?
It depends on how we're defining misappropriation of assets, right? So I guess the point that I made was that from a utilitarian perspective, a botched privatization, I argue, was more favorable to no privatization at all. And therefore, to some extent, it's better to have the debate about whether or not resources are justly distributed than not have any resources to distribute. So that's why I stressed the fact that salary wages were paid once some of the oligarchs took over and that the companies run profitably. So I'd contend that, most of the wealth of the oligarchs, I would say, was generated after they became owners of large companies. So it wasn't purely because they were gifted shares in a company. It was predominantly because they grew that, having owned the company.
Well, it is rather remarkable, though, isn't it, that these people who happen to have done very well in the KGB and elsewhere also turned out to be these brilliant businessmen. But I find that a little bit suspicious.
But okay, so there's two ways. You're right, it is suspicious. But then the argument that I made was that that KGB training was very important skill set to do business in Russia. There was a lot. So for me, this is basically this is a return on their unique human capital. A lot of Western business.
But one thing we like to say as classical liberals is that the sort of skill sets that flourish under totalitarian regimes are not the sort of skill sets that flourish in free societies. So
Right. But Russia wasn't a wholly free society, and so what you had lots of Western companies that went into Russia very early on. So they saw this massive opportunity when Russia opened up. So they all piled in, and they got stung very badly because they didn't understand how to do business in that environment. And the former KGB guys did. So one of the explanations for why they managed to make so much profit, and again, this was profit that was being made having bought the companies, not a gift. It wasn't like an inheritance or something. Was a return.
Well,
on
I don't know if they bought the
capital.
companies; they acquired the companies.
Okay, but before they acquired the companies, so most of their return came through the management of that company, and then we can debate whether or not it's ideal that in order to make profit in Russia, you need to have a training that the KGB might provide you. But that is the reality of the situation, and it's better to have profitable companies that are paying salary and reinvesting, arguably, than having workers that don't get paid in companies that are fundamentally bankrupt. I appreciate that that's a somewhat utilitarian position to take. That's why I'm trying to be slightly provocative. But a lot of those former KGB guys now are no longer running these companies. They're either in prison or they're living as expats in London.
Yeah, on the proceeds, yes.
On the proceeds, but an argument that I would make is that Russia would probably be a better place if they were still running those companies in Russia rather than living off the proceeds as expats. You could argue, I kind of briefly touched upon it, and so if we want to take a classical liberal line, I think it's a myth to say that the privatization was corrupt in the sense that it was given away to cronies. If anything, I think too many of the shares in the companies were given to workers of those companies. And what typically happened was that the workers were given shares in the one way to put this is that they were given shares in a company. They didn't have any concept of shares because they didn't live in that system. And so then you had very savvy people that came along and bought up those shares at below market prices. The danger with that is that that leads you to the opinion that the workers are either stupid or don't fully appreciate the value of the shares that they're being given if they sell them on to the people that ultimately own them. And I quite like the alternative view, which is that they valued the bottle of vodka or whatever it was they exchanged for the shares that these bits of papers in these companies that they ended up giving away.
Okay.
That's the problem. The classical liberal view problem is to have to explain why it's unjust that the people that did receive vouchers in the privatization sold them for so little money to the oligarchs. And what I'm saying is that the reason why we consider that to be cheap now is partly a function of the value of the company that the oligarchs created, and also it's unclear that we can kind of easily determine that they were that they were fooled or rights were violated in those transactions.
Okay, thank you.